Good afternoon, everyone. Before we begin, a quick housekeeping note. Today's webinar is being recorded, and both the recording and presentation slides will be available on our HRTP portal. We'd love to know who's in the room, so please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat by sharing your name and organization. I'm Laura Watson, the High Road Community of Practice Coordinator at the UC Berkeley Labor Center, and I'm joined today by Michaela Canu, our green economy researcher. A big thanks to Michaela, who will be managing the technology. If you have any Zoom issues, feel free to direct message her for assistance. Today, we'll hear from two practitioners about the Contra Costa Refinery Transition Partnership, which emerged in response to the 2020 closure of the Marathon Martinez oil refinery, an event that led to over 700 workers being laid off and forced into economic uncertainty. From this partnership, we're pleased to welcome Josh Sonnenfeld, Senior California Strategist and State Policy Manager at the Blue Green Alliance, and Jesse Hammerling, Co-Director of the Green Economy Program at the UC Berkeley Labor Center. But before we dive into their insights, I'd like to turn it over to Pam Egan, Director of the Labor Management Partnerships Program at the Labor Center, who will help frame today's discussion.
Great. Thanks, Laura. I appreciate that. And thanks to you and Michaela for making this possible, and to Josh and Jesse for the insights that you're going to share today. We're really looking forward to it. I also want to welcome to the HRPP Community of Practice some guests that we've invited to join us for this topic. Some state and local agencies from Arizona, New Mexico, Minnesota, and Michigan, and Cook County, Illinois, who are doing work around climate transition careers and infrastructure careers under a project with the Families and Workers Fund. And some of our technical assistance partners from third sector and social finance, and some folks from the Families and Workers Fund. So our community's a little bigger today and all the richer for it. I wanted to do just a little framing of the topic for sort of the variety of voices in the room. Often we think of high road partnerships as training structures, right, that bring together workers and employers and are supported then by conveners or intermediaries, community organizations, and education partners, and sometimes public agencies. But if we start to sort of peel back the layers of the onion, right, the high road onion, we start to see how these partnerships develop as problem-solving relationships that are centered around some level of work, right? Maybe it's work at the firm level, work at the occupation level. Sometimes it's work at the sector level, sometimes bounded by geography. And what makes these relationships high road is that they place workers in a position of decision-making, responsibility, authority, and power, so that the solutions that come out of these relationships are then accountable to both sides of the market equation, right? The worker side and the employer side. And then as communities of interest who are impacted by the work are brought into the relationship, that problem-solving infrastructure that starts to be built becomes accountable to an ever-widening circle of stakeholders, right? Now, the Contra Costa High Road Partnership story gives us a really terrific and I think rare kind of view into the development of such an infrastructure at its earliest stages, right? It starts with workers at the center, at the sector level, within a geographic boundary, in a sector where the presumptive or traditional or expected employer partners are exiting the market, transitioning out of the market. And then it expands to the communities of interest that are impacted by that sector and by that transition. And together, these folks create processes and mechanisms to build shared understanding about the sector and its impacts, to develop multiple strategies to address those impacts, and even to create ways to invite new employer partners to the table. So the future becomes sort of unbound with this kind of problem-solving infrastructure. And it's all done with a high road approach of shared decision making that's accountable to all of those stakeholders. So as we hear the story, let's listen for the critical role played by folks who do the same kind of work that each of you do, right? Again, workers, conveners, community organizations, educational institutions, and public agencies, and sometimes even philanthropy. And each that have their own set of needs and interests that sometimes overlap and sometimes compete, right? So, and as a quick note for public agencies and philanthropy on the call, we've got the insights from this partnership in part because the California Workforce Development Board invested in it as one of several regional workforce strategies that focused around planning around economic shifts at the regional level that required collaboration like this to advance co-equal goals of quality job creation, climate resilience, and equity, right? So the work might have happened without that funding because the partners do this work on the ground, but perhaps not as timely and not to the depth that was catalyzed by those resources. So Josh and Jesse, we're really glad you've joined us. You're here to tell us the Contra Costa story and share the strategies and lessons learned.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Pam and Laura, Michaela, and the Labor Center. We're so grateful to be here. I'll introduce myself, and then maybe Jesse, you can introduce yourself, and then I'll share the slides. So I'm Josh Sonnenfeld. I'm the Senior California Strategist with Blue Green Alliance. We're a national alliance of labor unions and environmental organizations working on building the clean economy. And I'm also the facilitator of the Contra Costa Refinery Transition Partnership. Jesse?
And I'm Jesse Hammerling. I'm the co-director of the Green Economy program at the UC Berkeley Labor Center. So I'm lucky enough to get to work with Pam and Laura and Michaela all the time on other things too. The Green Economy program is one of the research and policy teams at the Labor Center. And I was also the research lead on this project. So glad to be here.
And shout out, I think there's at least one, if not a couple of our HRTP members here, including Emma from Asian Pacific Environmental Network. Thanks for joining us, Emma. And again, thank you all for being here. So I'm going to share some slides, and I'm really excited about this conversation because it's rare that we get a chance to debrief what exactly we've done and what worked and what hasn't with a like-minded group of folks working on similar types of issues. So today we're going to be really sort of taking a look back of around the foundations of the Contra Costa Refinery Transition Partnership as a planning HRTP and lessons learned that can be useful for you all as you consider your work. As Pam was sort of teeing up for us. And so today we're going to be in terms of our agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about the origins and goals of the partnership. Jesse's going to sort of do a little deep dive into how we integrated research and learning into our consensus building process. I'll talk about some of the policy development work. We'll talk about where we landed, what was the outcome of this 3.5-year project, and then also what are some additional achievements that happened as a result of this work. And then we'll talk a little bit about lessons learned, open it up for hopefully about 15 minutes of question and answer. And then I know Pam and Laura have some prompts for you all to go into small groups to discuss some questions to translate some of the lessons from our work into what might be useful for you all moving forward. So that's what we've got for today, and I'm going to dig into some of the origins. So. The broader political context and sort of economic context of this project, it really is part of the process of the state of California decarbonizing. And so for many years, California has been a real leader in decarbonizing our economy, initially focused on getting the electric sector to be 100% renewable. But then in recent years, really shifting attention to or added attention to the transportation sector, which is the single largest source of emissions in the state. And so about in 2020, we had an executive order from the governor to phase out the sale of gas-powered vehicles. Shortly afterward, we had our first ever statewide decarbonization plan from the California Air Resources Board. It was in 2022. And we're the #1 market for electric vehicle sales. So we've largely been keeping pace with those goals. In fact, there was a recent study that came out saying that California is among 10 other states that are keeping pace with their EV sale targets. But it's all, it's really in response to the climate crisis and recognizing the wildfires, the droughts, the flooding that we've all been experiencing that really creates that urgency to act. Within this context, the Marathon Martinez oil refinery indefinitely idled in 2020. And this is one out of 5 refineries in the Bay Area, 4 of which are in Contra Costa County, one in neighboring Solano County. So we are the oil refining hub for Northern California. We produce the fuels that are used in Northern California and Northern Nevada. And when this refinery idled, Contra Costa County had a long history of labor unions and environmental justice organizations and others collaborating, particularly around refinery safety issues. But the just transition conversation wasn't really one that we were having. It wasn't. It was sort of sort of a wait and see type approach of like, we'll have this conversation when the time comes. But with the Marathon refinery idling, it was really this wake up call for us in Contra Costa County, for everybody, labor, environmental, government, industry, that the period of planning for refinery transition is not just something that's going to happen far off in the future, but it is here and it is now. And so when the refinery idled, over 700 workers were laid off with very short notice. This included 350 members of the United Steelworkers Union, Local 5. And it really prompted this conversation of, how can we prepare better for future, refinery closures? What is going to be the pace and scale of closures, and how can we make sure that workers and communities are at the center of this process? We did a whole study that Jesse will be talking about what happened to the Marathon Martinez workers, but there was not a very good safety net in place for them, and there was a lot of hardship that was experienced from that closure. And also, the community was really not engaged particularly well in terms of what happens next after this facility closure, and a lot of questions of how are workers and communities involved in sort of planning for what's next. So that was really the origin of the Contra Costa Refinery Transition Partnership. Was the steelworkers approached APEN, the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, and Blue Green Alliance, and other partners, and said, hey, we want to be able to prepare better for future refinery closures, but we need to understand what are the pace and scale of the energy transition, and what are those impacts on workers, on communities, what are the types of policies that we need to have in place. And so, Blue Green Alliance, we have a very long history of working with the steelworkers and all of the partners here. And they asked us to facilitate, pulling together a proposal to the California Workforce Development Board, the HRTP program, to create a partnership to plan for refinery transition. And I don't think we actually thought we were going to get the funding. We thought it was going to be a shot in the dark, but really grateful for the leadership and vision of the Workforce Development Board's leadership, and understanding that, this is a huge economic transition, and we need to think about how we can support workers and communities in this change and the new economies that we're trying to build. But I want to say, in terms of the mechanics of the partnership, we're definitely a non-traditional HRTP, right? You see on this list of partners, there's no employers that are at the table in our partnership. And the reason why is because we are planning for an industry that is declining, and thinking about, what are the new industries that are going to be coming to our region, and what are the policies that are going to be needed to ensure a just transition. And so it's a little bit different from that perspective. But it was very intentional in that we were really centering the leadership of frontline workers and frontline communities together. And so the voting members of our partnership are the steelworkers, the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, the Labor Council, which represents about 85,000 workers in Contra Costa County, including other impacted unions, and the Plumbers Union, UA Local 342, which represents the building trades, who does a lot of the turnover and maintenance work. Blue Green Alliance, we're really a supportive partner. The Labor Center is our research lead, and the California Federation of Labor Unions is also a supportive partner in this partnership. But again, we're really centering the leadership of those that are most impacted to lead our partnership. I'll also say that in terms of those interested in the mechanics, that we had an MOU that clearly defined our decision-making process, and how we're working together, even including on things like fundraising. We have had a consensus model, which at times could makes things more complicated, but really was core to our work, is that we were only advocating for policies that, we had consensus around. And, it really worked well for us. I also want to say, before I pass it over to Jesse to talk about sort of the research model, that this partnership, while it may have been formed after the closure of the Marathon Martinez refinery, it takes place within the context of decades of environmental injustice in Contra Costa County, and a recognition that, low-income communities, communities of colors, and immigrant communities are disproportionately impacted in Contra Costa County and by refinery pollution, that has led to really significant health and economic impacts, from cardiovascular disease, pulmonary disease, increased rates of preterm birth, the list goes on. And so our partnership, and as we think about refinery transition, it's about how can we advocate for policies that make sure communities that have been impacted by, the refining industry are also supported in the transition, as we're also supporting workers that are going to be impacted. So next, I'm going to pass it over to, I got one more slide before I pass it to you, Jesse, around the goals of the partnership. So it was around building relationships between impacted workers and frontline community organizations, doing research to help us inform sort of potential policy actions around, the impact, space, and scale of refinery transition, developing a package of recommendations on those areas of consensus that meet the needs for refinery workers and communities, and commissioning research from the Labor Center to develop a whole high road and just transition economic development strategy to accompany that those policy recommendations. And right now we're in the midst of determining our approach for implementing our recommendations. All right, I'm going to pass it over to you now, Jesse, to walk us through our research process.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about what the research was that we did as part of this partnership, and sort of how it fed into the consensus building process. So let's go to the next slide. Cool. So there were sort of 5 more or less discrete research projects that we completed as part of this work, including with some great external researchers that we subcontracted with. And each of these served a specific purpose in the context of the project. So this is sort of a more or less chronological overlapping order of the studies that we completed and their objectives. I'll just run through these really quickly, and then we're going to talk through each of them. So the first was the fossil fuel layoff study that Josh mentioned, led by Virginia Parks at UC Irvine. And the purpose of this was to understand the impacts of refinery closures on workers, right? And the second study was the Bay Area Refinery Transition Analysis, led by Christina Simeon at the University of Colorado School of Mines. And the goal of this study was to anticipate, really get some good information on future changes at the Bay Area refineries. The next piece of research was around impacts of the refinery industry in Contra Costa County, and that was led by Bettany Jones at Inclusive Economics, along with myself and others. And the goal of this part of the research was to anticipate the impacts of additional closures on the local economy and on public health in Contra Costa. The next piece was a decommissioning and cleanup analysis, led by Connie Cho and others at APEN, the purpose of which was to identify needs and challenges related to site cleanup after refinery closures. And then the last piece here is the Just Transition Economic Development Framework. And in this report, which we'll talk a little bit more about in depth, we integrated the learnings from the other research studies into a stakeholder-informed framework for economic development planning that can achieve a just transition. So let's go to the next slide. And before we talk about each of the studies in turn, I wanted to just say a few points about the process here. So the research was really an ongoing and iterative, integrated part of the work of this partnership. So it really wasn't a see you later, we're going to go do a study and we'll tell you what we found. The process of designing, conducting the work, sharing the findings from the research as we went, it was a really important part of the consensus building process. So this slide just shows a couple of the highlights of what that meant. So iterative and ongoing engagement with the partners throughout each of these projects. We sought input on research questions and our approach to the analysis. We shared and discussed research learnings as we went with the partnership. And all of this helped us establish a common foundation of understanding of the landscape and the partners' shared challenges in Contra Costa County. So it was kind of a safe space for learning among the groups involved in the partnership, and for learning from each other. And then finally, partner input really shaped the framework itself, especially around the economic development piece, and also the strategies for really communicating about and sharing our findings with the world. So let's run through each study quickly. So I'll start with the fossil fuel layoff one. And these are I'm not going to go into detail about any of the findings here. We don't have time for that. So I just want to give a flavor of what each of these was really about and what we learned from it. So, as Josh mentioned, the layoff was the alarm bell and really the impetus for the project. And we don't actually have a lot of good information out there about what energy transition means for fossil fuel workers. So this study, this survey, and interviews with workers who were laid off at Marathon was really the first of its kind, looking at what happened to these workers after they were laid off. And the findings were really troubling. So a year after the layoff, 26% of workers were still unemployed. Among those who had found work within a year after the layoff, they took an average 24% wage cut in their new jobs. In addition to reporting, differences in working conditions, many of them lacking union representation in their new jobs, reporting concerns about health and safety standards that weren't what they were used to, et cetera. A third of the workers reported pretty serious financial challenges faced by themselves and their families after the layoff. And the final thing to note here is just, that, around 28% of the workers stayed in fossil fuel jobs, but, they moved into other industries. They were able to translate their skills into things like utilities, chemical treatment, other forms of manufacturing. So let's go to the next slide. So the refinery transition analysis. So this was the analysis that we hired some energy economists, really awesome energy economists, to do an analysis of changing demand for Bay Area refinery products based on California's existing climate policies, specifically the CARB 2022 scoping plan. So based on policies that are already in place in California, what changes do we anticipate in the market that will affect the Northern California hub of oil refining that's really located primarily in Contra Costa County? And the main finding here was significant demand decline for the main products produced by these refineries. So we anticipate a 92% reduction in Northern California gasoline production by 2045, assuming that exports are also declining at the same rate as overall production, as domestic production. Even if we think exports stay constant, which is unlikely, a 65% reduction in the capacity actually needed, the output needed by the Northern California refineries. So all this means that, by 2045, a potential and likely outcome here is that we would have one, maybe two small Bay Area oil refineries left in the region. So additional closures of these facilities are likely. That also means there could be significant acreage of refinery lands in the process of redevelopment. So this study really helped establish a common understanding among the partners that these changes are already in motion, right? So partners in this group do not all agree about how fast this transition should happen. But really the analysis here helped everybody get an objective perspective on what changes are already in motion and what's happening in the market for this industry that affects all of them. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the next one was an analysis of the economic and public health impacts of the refinery industry and its supply chain in Contra Costa County. So this was saying, well, let's take a look at the current impact of this industry on the region so that we can understand, as there's additional decline, what is that going to mean for public health and the economy? So for key findings, and this is extremely summary, there's obviously a lot more detail here. In terms of health, obviously, and as Josh mentioned, the refinery industry and its supply chain contributes to severe air pollution in the surrounding area. It has significant, costly, and unequal public health impacts, in particular for the neighborhoods surrounding the refineries, which have a higher proportion of low-income people of color and immigrants living there. In terms of the economic impacts, the refinery industry and its supply chain is a really important source of well-paying jobs for workers without a college degree in Contra Costa. There just aren't comparable opportunities for workers without a college degree that pay anywhere near what workers at the refinery make and have the same kind of benefits, health and safety standards that the union has fought hard for over many decades. And also in terms of tax revenue. So the refinery industry and all the industries locally that are kind of attached to the refinery industry and its supply chain, together they make up a pretty substantial share of local funding for essential government services in Contra Costa County and in the local cities, in addition to supporting public sector jobs. So this was also a really key common ground finding. And this whole part, I'll just say, was really tricky because sometimes these economic impact studies are used to paint the refinery industry in a good light, right? They're good employers, they pay their taxes. And that wasn't the goal of this analysis, right? The goal of this analysis here, the point was to be clear-eyed about what transition will cost, not as part of an argument to delay it, but as information to help prepare for it. And at the same time, there's, of course, health benefits of refinery closures, but those health benefits are not a foregone guarantee without adequate planning either, which will lead us to the next slide. So here we looked at scenarios for decommissioning and cleanup. So what will it take to really do decommissioning of these facilities right and do cleanup right? And what are the risks here? So in this analysis, we found, a lack of good publicly accessible data on the extent of contamination at refinery sites currently. And in addition, cleanup costs may actually incentivize refinery owners to seek out, delay, postpone facility closures. And there's a pretty high risk here that the refinery owners themselves will take tactics to seek or avoid or minimize cleanup responsibilities entirely. So all of this makes it really important that communities, local regulators, government must prepare ahead for the facility closures and conversions to ensure safety, proper cleanup, and to make sure that the community has the opportunity to actually be part of re-envisioning what that land is going to be used for, and therefore what type of cleanup is really appropriate, and what type of investment will be needed. There's also a cautionary tale here, I think, from the PES refinery in Philadelphia, which had a costly explosion after company disinvestment, and then the company went bankrupt and closed, and it left workers unemployed and the community on the hook with these toxic mess of lands and really extensive cleanup costs. So all of which is to say that, refineries shutting down will reduce these source emissions that cause really serious public health impacts, but also could pose ongoing risks, either from accidents or hazards as the companies disinvest in the facilities ahead of shutdown, and from pollution from toxic sites. So let's go to the next slide. So what do we make of everything we learned through this process? So there's some real challenges here, but there's also opportunities. In terms of challenges, the economic impacts here, are something really serious that the county has to deal with. The loss of good jobs and loss of significant source of resources, in terms of tax revenue for public services and public sector jobs. All of this against a backdrop of really serious economic inequality and declining middle wage jobs in the region. And there are serious public health impacts and costs currently. And we can't expect that the pollution burden or risks will suddenly be gone if there's shutdowns of these facilities. So all of this is to say that, Contra Costa needs an approach to economic development that really addresses the challenges it's up against, job loss, tax loss, and ongoing environmental and health hazards, and takes into account the needs and priorities of local communities and affected workers. So if we can do this, it really does present an opportunity to re-envision the economy, right? And to right the wrongs of some of these longstanding environmental and economic inequities in the region in order to grow a more equitable economy in the aftermath of refinery closures. And I'll talk more about the just transition framework in the next section, but I'll hand it back to Josh.
Thanks, Jesse. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the building consensus process within our partnership of how do we take all this research and actually develop policy recommendations. So we had 31 policy recommendations in our final report, and we'll have a summary of that in a little bit. And I'm going to share a process slide, and I'll show some pictures in a second. And it's a little bit unusual because, as you saw, just a glimpse of from Jesse, there's a lot of research that was done. And with the exception of the fossil fuel layoff study, we didn't release any of that research until the end. It's a little bit unusual, right? Normally, you develop your research, you release it, it's in the public, in the out there for the public to digest. And our primary purpose of doing the research was so that we could build consensus internally initially. And and I'll say there's a lot of conversations that I had with labor and community folks where, we're sharing charts about, the decline of the refinery industry, and, seeing folks grapple with that who maybe, spent their whole lives, working in a facility and think they're gonna, their kid is gonna spend the whole life working in a facility. And so being able to actually talk with folks about this research and engage them and not have them read it in a newspaper article for the first time was really important for our process, right? It's about engaging workers and communities together and grappling with these tough pieces so that we can come out of it with some shared framework rather than putting everything out there in the public and having people be lose their agency over the process. So that said, we started with a lot of the research and community engagement. The community engagement included we had a workshop series in the city of Richmond, one of our refinery cities, hosted by APEN, where over I think 3 or 4 workshops they engaged their membership on different themes related to refinery transition. We did a lot of briefings with this research with different stakeholder groups, private briefings to gather their feedback and input. I lost track, Jesse, of how many of those we've done at this point, but a lot. And then we developed 2 solutions development working groups. One was focused on worker safety net and transition. The other was focused on community solutions. And these included groups from our partnership, but also groups that, from the broader community, other labor groups, other community groups that really represented those different perspectives in Contra Costa County. I will say, and I should have said this earlier, that we sought feedback from a large variety of groups, but we were also selective in terms of who we picked to include in the partnership based on who we thought could really work together well, right? And I think sometimes right now, we might have these processes where we think, oh, if we just throw everyone into a room with all these different perspectives, they're going to come out and they're going to have alignment. And I don't believe that. I think you need to center those folks that are most impacted, but also understand that, some organizations are going to be much more, willing to collaborate than others. So we created these 2 different working groups. And over several months, they were the ones that actually developed our policy recommendations. So they digested the research and they worked collaboratively to develop a slate of policy recommendations. And then we brought those recommendations to a big solutions retreat. And it was wonderful because there was a lot of overlap between the worker and community side, right? Guess what? Workers are community members, and many community members, they're workers too, right? And so there's a lot of shared interest in things like keeping refineries safe and making sure that refineries are properly cleaned up, and supporting workers and communities in their transition process, right? So I think we probably nailed down about 80 or 90% of our recommendations in that one retreat, which was over a 1 or 2 day period. But there was still some tougher stuff that we needed to sort out, and we continued to refine that over the next few months. And then we had a draft set of solutions, and then we did a whole other series of private briefings for other stakeholder groups. We wanted their feedback. We wanted to make sure that when we released our recommendations, that they would be really well received, by other stakeholder groups, labor groups, community groups, government. There were, I won't share details except to say there were some great things that came up through those briefings and some issues that we hadn't thought of that we were able to address thanks to that process. So it did take some time, but it was absolutely worth it. And then, we had our final recommendations, and we're able to write up our report and figure out our communication strategy around it, and then ultimately release them to the public this January. So this is a little bit of a snapshot of what our process looked like for development of our policy recommendations and strategies. But at the core of it, I mean, it's the process is all about people, right? So here's some shots of what this actually looked like. So On the top left, this is one of the stakeholder briefings that we did. I think this was at the Labor Council in Martinez. On the bottom in the center here, this was one of our communications meetings within our partnership, figuring out, well, we've got these great recommendations. Now, how the heck do we talk about them together in a way that, works for us? And then one of my favorite moments in the bottom right here, this was actually during our solutions retreat, and we were having these tough conversations, and then it was lunchtime, and everyone decided they still want to sit together and have lunch. And I just love that. Like, to me, that just really speaks towards like, what does it mean to build real partnerships? Like, it's more than just collaboration. You're building friendships, you're building relationships. And in the top right, you can see how else those relationships show up. So there was a point where the steelworkers went on strike, and everybody from the partnership came out to the picket line to support them. And we're very happy to do so, right? And kids in tow as well. And then a couple these are jam boards here with all these sticky notes. These are from APEN's community workshop in Richmond. And just to give you an illustration of, just how many different types of feedback we got from community members as well through this process, asking them directly what they wanted. And so, it was great to get that direct feedback. And so it was a mostly linear process, but, involved hundreds of people if you added them all up, and a lot of relationship building and solidarity through the process. Okay, so now we're going to just briefly share with you where did this all land. So our final reports, as I mentioned, this January, we released our full report and recommendations of the Contra Costa Refinery Transition Partnership. There's actually two reports that were co-released, the report and the policy recommendations, and then a separate report from the UC Berkeley Labor Center that's much more in depth on all of the research, as well as the sort of just transition economic development framework that Jesse will speak about in a second. I won't go through all the 31 policy recommendations. You can read the report. You can ask me whatever questions you want, but they covered 5 different categories that are listed here around planning and oversight, worker safety net transition, land use, decommissioning and cleanup, refinery community support and transition, and then just transition economic development. So 31 concrete policy recommendations. We know it's not all going to happen overnight, but it really sets a shared sort of political agenda and strategy of how can we move forward in planning, in centering refinery communities and workers in the energy transition. And then I'll pass it over to Jesse to talk about the other report.
Great. Yeah. So we synthesized the findings from the various research projects and from the consensus building process itself into a report on the impacts of transition in Contra Costa County, the challenges it poses, opportunities, and a framework for achieving a just transition through economic development in the region, and really just transition as defined by the most affected stakeholders. So I'm just going to briefly run through some of the key parts of that framework. And I also want to shout out Michaela, who is helping on this call with some of the great research that she did that informed this work as a research assistant. So next slide. So this is how we describe a just transition approach to economic development planning here. So it's one in which the quality of growth matters as much as the quantity, and local communities are at the center of shaping the county's vision for its future economy. In a just transition approach, environmental justice and economic justice are not oppositional forces to growth. Instead, they are necessary complementary strategies for achieving a certain quality of growth. And so this, folks who are involved in the high road community, this should look somewhat familiar to you. This is really drawing on key concepts from high road economic development, but adapted to a just transition context and really informed substantively by the priorities of the folks in the partnership. So the next slide, we'll dig into what exactly that means. So what are the priorities for a just transition? As we said, there's a lot of challenges, but it's also a moment of opportunity to really re-envision what the economy could look like. So as the county prepares for changes in the refinery industry, it can address these longstanding inequality and environmental inequities. And so these were the 3 priorities that rose to the top for the partners in terms of like the guiding priorities for just transition economic development. So the first is good jobs. So increase the quality of jobs and ensure those jobs who are accessible to those who need them most, including displaced refinery workers and workers from historically marginalized communities. The second is healthy communities. So stop polluting air, land, and water in communities that have had disproportionate pollution burdens, and target environmental and health improvements in those areas. And the third is economic resilience. So reduce the county's economic dependency on fossil fuel production by diversifying and increasing other sources of tax revenue. So the goal here is to look for things that are really in the middle of the Venn diagram, look to prioritize investments and economic development activities in the middle, things that meet all three of those priorities. So next slide. So we developed a framework for pursuing economic development that achieves a just transition based on those priorities. So it's really not a business as usual approach to economic development. It's a mission-oriented approach that takes into account the specific needs and priorities of transition-impacted stakeholders. So again, built on key concepts from High Road. So it starts with the priorities, the Venn diagram, good jobs, healthy communities, economic resilience. And then you approach planning with key principles about an effective and democratic process. So that means committing to democracy, workplace democracy, worker and community engagement in planning and decision making, and protecting workers' right to organize into unions. And two, pursuing demand-driven strategies that ensure just transition outcomes. And I'm sure this is something that you all talked about a lot. Focus on growing the jobs you need and embedding your training strategies in good job strategies. And then the next part of the framework is policy tools that you use to ensure that you get the outcomes and the process that you're looking for here. So, game plan tools that help make sure that, there's an inclusive process, goalpost tools to direct growth and investment at the things that really represent those shared priorities. And then guardrail tools to ensure that community and worker-defined outcomes are achieved and really making sure that, we're not getting those low-road outcomes. And then finally, we recommend sort of two key strategies, right? And we go into a lot more detail in the report, but at the highest level here, it's investing in infrastructure that supports just transition priorities, so physical and natural infrastructure and social infrastructure, and invest in industries that can meet those just transition priorities and can really help the county move along towards those goals. Yeah, so there's a lot more to say here, but just to highlight two key things about the framework. One is that job quality is really a core part of the strategy. It's not all of it. But it is one thing that is bringing folks together around shared priorities. And there's its importance of the union difference in growing opportunity both for refinery workers and for low-income communities in Contra Costa County. So building quality union jobs is a really key part of the common solution here. But it's those three priorities: good jobs, healthy communities, and economic resilience. That's what sort of allowed us to articulate the common ground vision here. I'll pass it back to Josh.
Thanks, Jesse. So now I'm going to share a couple, one of the wonderful things about the HRTP community and just the program is the ability of partnerships like ours to, have accomplishments that go outside of, of our achievements just within our HRTPs itself. So I'm going to mention a few things of sort of like, what did we accomplish in addition to the partnership itself? And so, one of the things was at the Marathon Martinez worker study. This was the fossil fuel layoff study. It's actually the most detailed academic study ever done in the United States from what we found on fossil fuel workers after layoff. And it helped significantly help to design the state's Displaced Oil and Gas Worker Fund and support the design of the United Steelworkers Union developing a statewide displaced oil worker program called the California Oil Workers Readiness Program. They got a $9.8 million grant. So that was not something our partnership worked directly on, but our research and our design of those workforce transition strategies absolutely, was fundamental to that success. Several of our partners, including the Labor Council and the Asia Pacific Environmental Network, ended up leading our California Jobs First sub-regional process for Contra Costa County. That probably would not have happened had they not already been collaborating and already had a shared sort of economic understanding and framework through our work. The research that Jesse's done and through the Labor Center has really been foundational for something called the Green Empowerment Zone, which is set up through the state legislature It's a regional effort within the refinery corridor of Contra Costa and Solano counties to basically plan for the new economic development as the refinery industry declines. And the Labor Center is now providing research and technical assistance over multiple years for that project. Again, largely coming out of this work. A number of our partners, not all of them, this was not a partnership project, but a number of our partners came together to develop a high road manufacturing initiative for the Bay Area, recognizing that the important role around clean manufacturing as part of just transition and for combating inequality and creating quality jobs within our region. That was funded through California Jobs First Catalyst recently. And this research, it's informing just transition work elsewhere in the country and also actually internationally. Right now, Virginia Parks, who did our fossil fuel layoff study, I think she's in Helsinki, Finland, comparing oil refinery worker transition to coal worker transition. So, this work really does inform, the others working in similar areas around the country and the world. Okay, so a few lessons learned. And I think this is our last slide, or one of our last slides through this process. And so number one, centering the leadership of most impacted workers and communities. This is not optional, right? Like this is foundational, I think, to the HRTP program is that, we are specifically, supporting the leadership of those that are most impacted by the challenges we are addressing. We did that in the design of our partnership, that proved to be critical throughout the whole process. Using research to develop common knowledge as a foundation for building consensus and common ground, as Jesse laid out. I think it's a really valuable resource that the HRTP program offers. A lot of times, philanthropies, they might fund groups to go out there and do policy advocacy, but if you were to go to a funder and say, hey, we want you to fund 2 years or 3 years of research and deep engagement to maybe develop some policies at the end, like they may not say, there's not a lot of funders who would say yes to that, but the state's investment, and shout out to Kaina and the Workforce Development Board team here, has really enabled, this deep work that has allowed us to move, to develop some consensus around some really challenging policy areas. Number three is moving at the speed of trust, but keep it moving, right? So, we can't sometimes you can't force consensus building, but you need to have a roadmap of where you're going, right? And that's part of the skill set and the challenge of being a good facilitator, right? Is don't force people when they're not ready. Do the research that's needed, do the stakeholder work that's needed to inform our approach, but it's still gotta, you gotta keep in mind your goals, right? Be clear where you want to go, but we want to adapt. Number four. And so thinking about, well, maybe you want to speak towards that one, Jesse. Do you have a comment there?
Yeah, I mean, we started, and maybe this is an interesting forum to rate this, but we started with the high road framework, and we realized through our conversations with partnerships with the partners in the group that like they didn't quite meet the needs and reflect the priorities of the partnership in a specific way. And so that was just one example of like in the course of developing the economic development framework, like we had to adjust the framework we were using to analyze and talk about the work in a way that even though we sort of started with that and kind of ran with it for a little while, once we kind of got to the synthesis phase, we had to take a step back and really listen to what was going to work for folks.
Mm-hmm. So landing around sort of the just transition framework more than the high road frame, at least in the narrative context.
Right. Adapting the high road framework to a really specific just transition context that reflected more specifically the needs and concerns of the partners involved.
Yeah. So number five, I would say this one we could have done better at. And so hopefully this is a cautionary lesson for you all of weaving additional funding sources from the get-go, right? I think when we first got our grant, we said, great, we've got this 3-year runway. And then, as we were moving at the speed of trust, right, you start to realize you need additional time or additional resources, right? And so layering in those funding sources, even when you don't think you might not need them at the get-go, is really critical. And so we've had to catch up on that. And then lastly, innovation takes time and trust, right? I think that's the, the wonderful aspect of HRTPs, and particularly these types of planning grants is, some of California's most challenging problems are not things that personally I believe can be solved in one legislative session, right? You'd have to take complex problems and take them apart, do research, build consensus in order to find common ground. But once you can find that common ground, you can go a lot quicker. And so I think those are the 6 lessons learned we've got for you all today. And with that, I think we're going to open it up for some questions for a few minutes before we get into some of the small group breakouts.
Thanks, Josh and Jesse. So if folks want to raise your hand and we can call on you, or you can type your question in the chat.
And while we're waiting for questions too, I'll just give a shout out to Rafa Aguilera and Jesse Flores from the Workforce Development Team. There are our support staff and CWDB. I think I saw some other folks from the Marisol there and other folks from the Workforce Development Board too. Just thanks for your support.
Great stuff. Lord, I think I heard you call on me. I'm going to tee up a question that I hear a lot from several of the folks on this call and the folks that we work with in the Families and Workers Fund cohorts. How did you define good jobs?
Well, we had a really clear benchmark here because we were looking at the refinery jobs, and one of the impetus questions here was, they should have something comparable to go into. And the very first study we did showed how we were very much at risk of that not being the outcome here, right? Folks who were laid off did report lower wages and worse job quality and less access to unions once they found new jobs after the layoff. And so, part of, I think, what our partnership was defining as just transition is that workers should have access to opportunities that are at least as good as the ones that are being lost here, if not better, and that a broader range of folks should have access to those jobs, right? The economic analysis we did of the region showed that for blue collar workers without a college degree in the county, there's really a lack of access to jobs that can pay enough to really support a family, that pay much above the minimum wage in the county. And so creating more jobs that have those like middle wage, union jobs, good job quality, health, and ability to advocate for health and safety, like that was a priority that was in common, both for the refinery workers who were at risk of losing their jobs, but also for community members who would like working class communities in the region to have more access to good jobs more broadly.
Thank you.
We have a question. How did you do the skills mapping?
So we used a data set, the ONET Career Match data set, that articulates the skills for occupations and identifies like top aligned occupations that draw on similar skill set. So I'm happy to share more information about the sort of detailed methodology that we use, but basically, for the main occupations in the refineries, what are the most common skill sets that workers use in their jobs? And then what are other occupations and industries that draw upon the same skill set? So there's data that we can draw on, all of which we can flesh out and ground truth with the folks in the partnership who actually do this work and represent workers who do this work. So that's a little bit of the process.
And it's in Appendix B, or I think it's the second appendix in your report, Jesse, which is it's one of my favorite parts, and it's a little buried, unfortunately, but it's the refinery worker skills match.
Job batch analysis.
Job match analysis.
And I'll say one thing else about that. So we have the 24% wage decline statistic from the fossil fuel layoff study, but our findings from the job match analysis about the wages for comparable jobs outside of the refineries were even more stark. So for refinery workers, they typically earn, for the frontline occupations, or in Contra Costa, they're earning at or above $50 an hour plus benefits. for jobs in manufacturing outside of the refineries in, in other manufacturing industries, which are much less likely to be represented by a union, the average wage in the region, the median wage in the region is $25 an hour. So it's a 50% wage cut, in addition to pretty stagnant job growth in general. So it's just illustrating what it is an uphill battle. Like there's not abundant jobs for them to go into, and the ones currently that exist in the economy that are a good match for the skills of these workers pay around half the wages that workers are making now.
You have one. Can you say more about policy recommendations for helping marginalized local populations find work in just transition vision? And that will be all the time question. So
You want to take this one, Josh?
Sure. And I'll try to weave in Rafa's question too, is asking about how the term just transition came back, which it's I could keep that short. I mean, so there's a whole page in our report around just transition, and we made a choice as a partnership that to intentionally sort of take back the term just transition that had been used in a variety of different ways that either talk about only workers or only communities. And we, are very clear that it should be both. It has to be both, right? It's about just transition for workers and communities together. And that's very much part of the economic analysis too, right? It talks about how there have been workers that have not been able to access quality jobs within the refinery sector. There was segregation within the refinery industry. I remember hearing stories through family up until I think the 70s that folks of color weren't able to access certain jobs, and there's still folks that can't access refinery jobs because of prior criminal records or other reasons, right? And so that's why the good jobs is intentionally structured about workers and communities together and not either or. And that the strategies, throughout, the economic analysis, we're not picking and choosing one industry or another, but it's a recognition that we need to build a high road economy in Contra Costa that lifts up, multiple industries, right? That can create multiple pathways for displaced workers from the refinery sector, for communities that have been disinvested, whether that's healthcare, manufacturing, infrastructure, construction, right? And that it's those high road standards and access to those high road jobs that are going to be critical for not just displaced workers, but local communities as well. I don't know if you have anything to add there, Jesse.
Yeah, we need more good quality jobs that are for everyone in order to make those access and equity strategies lead somewhere.
Great. So I think we were going to wrap up some questions, but I'm going to take a point of privilege and ask one more that I want to sort of make sure and put a point on for these guys. And it kind of relates, I think, but you guys know, to the GEZ work, this notion of inviting, you pointed out that that the partnership in this case was sort of absent the employer side in its generation, we understand why. And now you're in this place where one of the things, the outgrowths of the project is about bringing employers in, inviting employers to the table, sort of moving down that road. Can you talk a little bit more about that to the degree that you can?
Sure. Yeah, and this is, separate from the work of the partnership, but very much emerged from the work that we were doing. And the Labor Center is the research and technical assistance lead for the Green Empowerment Zone. And the goal of our work is to design and implement a high road strategy to grow clean energy manufacturing in the region. So to really pick one industry that we think can meet that center of the Venn diagram criteria, right? Meet the needs of refinery workers, can be done in a way that doesn't perpetuate health inequities, and that can help diversify the economy away from reliance on the refineries. Pick one thing that we really think could be in that lane where there's an opportunity and a need to actually grow those domestic supply chains. And the opportunity for this developed under Biden. So the landscape has changed a little bit, but I think the need and the opportunity is still there, even though the federal landscape is different. And it's really about, so what's needed? What is an economic development strategy that actually adheres to those principles of good jobs, healthy communities, and economic resilience? So how do we actually make this happen? And so, we're trying to, in our role, doing research on how to target these industries, what are growth strategies that work, and what are approaches that actually incentivize that high road competition instead of low road competition. And at the same time, providing technical assistance around building high road partnerships around any individual project, right? So making sure that there is stakeholder engagement in any new projects that should emerge from the outset, and seeing that as an asset and not a barrier to economic growth and economic development.
Super. I appreciate that. And I'll just say that the participants on the in the webinar will have access to these reports. They're available, and I know we've all got a million more questions, so dive into the reports to get to some of those questions. So we're going to just break out into really quickly into a couple of small breakout rooms, so you guys can talk to each other a little bit about this. And we're proposing to tee up a couple of questions. Laura's going to drop a document in the chat with a couple of questions for you to think about. The first is, how can our HRTPs, or if you're in a state agency, how can states support this work? How can we play offense in anticipating significant needs or opportunities in our sectors? How can we be proactive to develop strategies and plan for high road outcomes? In this case, arising out of decommissioning, but what's going on in your sector, right? And then secondly, how can we, this notion of consensus decision making, bringing people together across their differences to find the center of the Venn diagram, the common ground to tackle some of the largest challenges. So there's a copy of those questions in the chat. Go ahead and grab that. Laura's going to randomly put folks in breakout rooms. Talk to each other about that. Choose a reporter. We're going to bring you back in and ask you to report out a couple of sentences on what came up for you. Okay. Well, let's do a quick report out in our last few remaining minutes here. Group one, did you have a chance to pick a reporter who can tell us a little bit about your conversation?
I think that's our group.
Yep.
I mean, yeah, I can do it. Yeah, I think really, I think we were touching on the being intentional with consensus building, how like that's something that you just even just seeing the presentation that you all did, and the post-it notes, and the have people being willing to have lunch after. I mean, I think that's something that shouldn't be just like watered down. I think definitely like having that kind of intentionality. And then Purvi, one of the other folks on our breakout room from the Semi Foundation, yeah, just like bringing up these issues with yeah, how do you get buy-in with between employers and the community-based organizations? Yeah, I don't know if anyone from my group wants to add more. Yeah.
That's great, Jesse. Thanks. Can I just go off script again a little bit here? And Jesse and Josh, that's such a big deal. Do you have any additional comments to sort of clear out? How do you get buy? It's such a hard question, of course. How do you get buy-in? I mean, what do you do?
I mean, I think to be real, we also benefited from the folks we worked with. Some of them had years of relationships together, like APEN and Steelworkers. They and BGA. We worked together after the Chevron Richmond refinery fire in 2012, and so like long-term relationship building, it really matters in these moments in leadership. And I'm sure there's moments where everybody had to talk to their folks of like, why are we doing this and why does it matter? But it starts at a commitment level and understanding that like the only way we're going to be able to move forward is together, and that we're going to get a lot farther, and just deep respect and care for each other. And that takes time to build. And sometimes that might not be there, right? Like that's my comment about sometimes you can't force partnership when it's not desired, right? There has to be some value alignment. And so, in the context of employers, I've done some technical assistance work and around community benefit plans, and there are great employers that really understand high road and are willing to collaborate, and they just need help sort of understanding like what goes in a community benefit plan, what is labor neutrality, like how do we work with communities. But then there are some employers that they just don't like, they're not receptive, right? And so, there are some you're going to be able to work with and some that you aren't. But again, I think it takes really focusing on the long term and understanding, what everyone's goals are and seeing if there's some common ground that can be built over time there.
Super helpful. Thanks for that point, Josh.
Um,
And now let's move on. Oh, Jesse, go ahead, please.
I was just going to add, I mean, I think part of it is like, having the trust and respect that comes out of that long-term relationship building so that the groups in the partnership can identify the common ground, but also like be honest with each other about where the common ground isn't. Because the goals and achievements of this project were not to bring everyone to the same position. It was to, expand what was possible to do by identifying a broader terrain of what they had in common. And just also welcome Emma to weigh in if you have anything to add here in this part.
No, I think you both were really well, capturing it well in terms of the benefits of that like, deep like discussion that we have been having with each other. And I think just kind of noting that it's like this is just the start of something that can go on like well beyond this. And it's it was really helpful that we had that like safer space for us to have those discussions internally. Yeah. Yeah, and being
Really,
direct with each other is good too.
that's great, Emma. We need to keep following up with you for additional insights. Thanks. So group two, Elizabeth, I think you're on.
Yeah, hello everybody. Elizabeth Toops from Baywork, and we've been working for years on the water wastewater industry, and building out competencies and training opportunities in that sector. And we've had, as I mentioned to the group, sort of limited but interesting intersection with the refinery transition issue and a couple of issues, a couple of things that I've noticed. What I would say is it's not as sort of quote unquote clean as you might think. Yes, both industries are in the most simplistic way, dealing with liquid flowing through pipes. But there's a big difference between the regulatory scheme around oil passing or gas or other petrochemicals flowing through pipes, and drinking water and wastewater flowing through pipes. And where we've seen that rub is with, on the workforce side, the highly regulatory scheme around water and wastewater operators, where these operators are required to have a certification from the state, and that requires coursework and work experience, paid work experience over a course of years. There's not a crosswalking between the industry sectors for that kind of work. And while there might be very relevant skills, competencies that a refinery worker may have, that could be relevant to the water wastewater industry, there's no way of really recognizing those competencies from the standpoint of a certification process. So is there a way for us to proactively work on that at the different levels, and also the worker representation is often very different as well. And are there ways to to bring those worker representatives together and to figure out how we might better sort of forecast what what those competency cross checks might look like.
Really super. And it sounded like there may be some opportunities to continue that conversation since you were able to bring it up and maybe figure some of that stuff out. That's wonderful. And I see Rafa has his hand raised. Jesse or Josh, did you want to respond to any of Group Two's comments? Any additional comments to layer on there? Okay. I think we're in good shape. And Rafa, you had your hand raised, I think.
Yeah, I was gonna give it a try with the mic. I'm in my car checking, tuning in, but I added around sort of context of the high road training partnerships that were regional economic development focus, which was the Kern County one and this one, both with fossil fuel industries kind of in transition, the economy. And interesting, in Kern County, there was also a just transition away from prison industrial complex with a couple of state prisons closing down. And in that context, these two refineries closing was kind of like portending the future of other refineries possibly becoming less economically sustainable in California. And, so I'm curious about how that adds a layer of, if you're creating a certification for the work that they're doing at the refineries, are you doing it within the fact in mind that there might be better or other industries that will have more jobs in the future? I know that was one of the issues that plagued the laid off workers, that they didn't have a credential showing, their vast amount of experience and how they could take those skills elsewhere once they were laid off.
Yeah. Yeah. And Jesse and Josh, any final comments to kind of wrap that up, or are we feeling well stated, Rafa, and this notion of being able to forecast that and using these resources to bring the community together to answer hard questions like that, right? Figure out what the future might look like from a shared perspective and shared understanding, and then build strategies to meet that future in ways that benefit all stakeholders at the table. Great. Well, I think that wraps it up. I really do want to, and I'll turn it back over to Laura. Just really recommending folks to dive into the documentation that will come with the webinar recording, because there's so many more questions we can ask, and many of the answers will be found in those reports and documentation. Laura, it's all yours.
Well, yes, thank you. And thank you once again to Josh and Jesse for sharing your insights and expertise and valuable lessons with our community of practice here. We really appreciate your work and your contributions. And we also want to thank all of you that joined today and participated. And we hope the session has provided a meaningful space for learning and connection. And as we mentioned, a recording of today's webinar, along with the presentation slides, will be available on our HRTP portal. So stay tuned for details on our next High Road Community webinar. We look forward to continuing these important conversations.